I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glynn,
your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors. And you're welcome to the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, bringing you the latest information, science and opinion to improve farm sustainability.
On this episode, Fiona Brennan, Teagasc soil and environmental microbiologist researcher based in Johnstown Castle, chats to us about soil health. Our greatest asset is our soil, but what actually lives in the soil beneath our feet? A quarter of all life can be found there.
How healthy are our soils? Are we hindering or helping our soil health? And what should we be doing to get the most from our soil in a sustainable manner? I started off by asking Fiona, what is soil and how much life does it actually contain?
Soil is comprised of a mixture of minerals, organic materials, and also pores, the spaces between the particles. They're either filled with air or water, and most of the life is actually present in the pore space. So that's really important to keep on to in your soil. In terms of life, our soils are absolutely teeming with life. There's a staggering number and diversity of organisms in soil, with over a quarter of all biodiversity in the planet in our soils. So it really is a globally important reservoir of biodiversity. And this is a whole range of organisms, different sizes, different shapes, doing different things. We have the very smallest life, the microscopic life, bacteria, fungi, archaea, nematodes, for example. Then up to larger organisms, which we'd call mesofauna. These would be springtails or mites. And then to the largest of organisms that we'd see in soils, earthworms or ants, which we can obviously see with the naked eye. So all of these organisms are operating in different scales, they occupy different niches. And as I say, there's a huge number of them. So we're talking in a handful of healthy soil. We could have over 100 million bacteria. We could have 100,000 protozoa. We could have 50 kilometers of fungal networks, what we call mycelium. It really is extraordinary. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what you could find in a soil.
There's people in severe shock at the moment listening to this because really when you pick up a handful of soil and we know farmers, it's synonymous with farming the soil and that grows their crops, but when we look at it and we know there's sand, silt and clay in it, but we kind of forget all the other stuff in it. Like farmers will be aware of earthworms and beetles and all that big stuff, but just when you talk about the amount of bacteria and fungi and all that stuff in it, it's frightening. And I remember looking at soils before when you're trying to figure out textures, and old scientists used to put the soil in their mouth to see what the texture was like, to see what percentage that. There's no way I'd put soil in my mouth after hearing what you've just said.
Most of them are friendly, Carl. But you're right, it's mind-blowing. And I work in this area and it still blows my mind every time I get to go out in the fields and pick up some soil and look in it. And they're just the organisms you can see with your eye. So it's absolutely phenomenal. It certainly is equivalent to the rainforests in terms of the biodiversity that we would see.
Fiona, soil health has now been mentioned in the same sentence as biodiversity, water quality and gaseous emissions. When it comes to sustainability, right, what does soil health actually mean?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Deirdre, and it's a term that's not kind of well understood. You could kind of think about it a bit synonymous to human health. What does human health mean? When we think about soils, we think about it in terms of functions. So soil has so many functions that are essential both to food production and agriculture, but also to broader society. So for example, 95% of our food comes from soil. It produces fiber, but it also sequesters carbon, regulates climate, it stores and cleans our waters, it's a home for biodiversity, and a whole range of other functions. So all of these functions, most soils have the capacity to do a broad range of functions, but not to the same degree. And when we talk about soil health, we're really talking about the capacity of that soil to deliver these functions. And importantly, different soils, as they have different capacities to function, but they all have to be assessed individually. So a soil, for example, that's very good at the productivity function may not have the same capacity to sequester carbon. But it shouldn't be judged in the same way as one that has a strong capacity to sequester carbon, but lower productivity. So we can't, one size does not fit all when it comes to assessing soil health, I suppose, is what I would say.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back. It's really good that you mentioned one soil doesn't fit all, because when we look at the water quality side of the house, now it's much more simple terms that we're looking at. We're looking at the physical function, I suppose, where a heavier soil will, I suppose, stop nitrate loss, whereas the lighter soils will maybe more prone to nitrate loss. So I think that concept of one size doesn't fit all is vitally important. You mentioned the soil functions there, Fiona, and I'm presuming microorganisms play a huge role in the soil functions, and so many that you just mentioned now. But is there certain practices that we're doing at the moment on farms that maybe might be affect the populations or are negative towards our microbes?
Yeah, Cathal, I mean, the microbial communities, soil biology in general, but particularly the microbial communities, because that makes up the largest proportion of the biology in soil, and they do a lot of the processes. They're vitally important to how the soil functions. So they're involved in a whole range of, I suppose, beneficial functions. They're the main drivers of nutrient cycling. They're transforming nutrients from one form to another, particularly non-available forms to plant-available forms. They're scavenging nutrients that are low in the soil. They're providing protection against pests and diseases. And they're also regulating climate, transforming and sequestering carbon or releasing carbon and transforming nitrogen. They provide vitamins and hormones for plants. And even in fact, down to the establishment of plants is strongly dependent on the microbial communities there. So if you don't have the right microbial communities, the plants won't establish to start with. And we often don't have to think about them of that. They're inherently there. But how we manage our soils has a strong impact on the communities that are there and what they're doing. So learning to manage our soils in a ways that I suppose looks after those really valuable members of the farming workforce is key. And in terms of things that might be, I suppose, reduce soil biodiversity, things like degrading down your soil organic matter, that would be something that would certainly reduce down the food and the habitat for organisms. Having fallow soil, some tilling operations can be negative to certain organisms, particularly larger organisms such as earthworms, where you have physical damage of the soil, either compaction or erosion. Again, you're removing the habitat and the food source for those organisms. And another issue would be monocultures, where you have a single crop growing in your field, and that tends to reduce down the diversity of organisms. Fertilization and chemical addition can also have negative effects on the diversity of microbial communities. So those would be the practices, I suppose, that might have a negative effect, but also there's many practices that can have a positive effect. For example, returning organic matter via slurry, etc. Diversifying your crops so you have a rich range of exudates going into your soil. Reducing down trafficability, or reducing down trafficking of animals or machinery when not suitable conditions. A whole range of practices that can be beneficial for those soil organisms.
Fiona, so what can farmers do then to protect and improve their soil biology? Are there any external inputs required?
Well, in many cases, you can probably manage with your inputs on your farm, but it depends on your system, I suppose. In general, for example, soil carbon would be relatively high on Irish farms, but if you have repeated tilling operations, you may see a reduction in soil carbon. So trying to reintroduce carbon via farmyard manure or other carbon sources would be beneficial. And the same is true of silage fields, where you repeatedly take off cuts, but you don't return any carbon. And also keeping a balanced fertility. When we remove crops from the system, we obviously take out nutrients, and if we don't have a balanced nutrients, it can be damaging to the system. And also, again, trying to diversify crops is hugely important. Having a living crop in the ground as much as possible of the year. We have various options, I suppose, of incorporating diversity into Irish farms. If it's a grassland systems, you might be able to increase the diversity of your swards by introducing herbs and legumes as well as your grass species. And then on the tillage side, you could introduce things like crop rotation, intercropping, yeah, a whole range of options there. But I suppose there's some learnings to do on the agronomic side of that as well. So it's about farmers finding a system that works for them.
Are we kind of falling into traps sometimes? Sometimes when I'm chatting to farmers of looking for quick fixes, maybe like you can buy something that can spread on land. Do we need to go down that route, or are the options that you just mentioned better long term?
Yeah, I suppose we have, I suppose, in decades past gone to more towards simplification of agriculture. You know, using, I suppose, a chemical fertilizer is more simple to use than an organic fertilizer, and it's the same with trying to replace, I suppose, organisms with sprays or whatever. But these aren't simple systems, and I think that's important to remember. So keeping the complexity is important, but there's a whole range of things that we can do that are very simple. We don't need any external inputs. It's just about using the resources that you have on your farm and making sure you're careful of protecting the physical soil structure, that you're getting the diversity into your farm, and also returning that organic matter. And if you have all those things lining up, you'd be going a long way to having good soil health. Another thing which I think is going to become increasingly important is reducing down external inputs of chemical fertilizer, because we've known for quite a while that particularly nitrogen fertilizer reduces down diversity of organisms in soil and also on the plant. And this is important. I think I'd like to emphasize the importance of diversity, and it's sometimes a concept that people find very difficult to get their head around. But if you have a single if you're putting, for example, a lot of nitrogen in excess nitrogen into your field, you reduce down the connections between your plants and your microorganisms, and you favor the proliferation of certain organisms, and the overall diversity declines. And it's a bit like, I like to think about it a bit like a hurling team. If you have to play a match, you have 15 players on your field, and each of them have a different role and a different skill set. And you need all of them working together to play the match and to perform. But even wider than that, not only the 15 players, but the really good teams also have a strong panel that they can pull from. So if somebody's having an off game or gets injured, you can pull those players on to perform the same roles. And the same is true in microbial communities. Many organisms have different functions, but they're not all operating at the same time. So if you have a stress, for example, a drought or something like that applied to your system, certain organisms might cease to function, and then you need those other players to pull off the panel and to put them on the field. So keeping that diversity is so important to how your whole soil functions, but also the resilience of your system to stress.
Fiona, going back, I suppose greenhouse gas emissions are on the agenda fairly high at the moment on farms and nationally, but can you tell me, microbes generate and mitigate against greenhouse gases? Can you tell me a bit about that, and can we use this to our advantage?
Yeah, Cathal, it's often not realised, but microorganisms are probably the main producers of greenhouse gases. So when we're talking about agricultural soils, we're primarily concerned about carbon dioxide or carbon and nitrogen. So there's been a lot of talk, I suppose, nationally and internationally about trying to increase carbon sequestration in soils. Soils are huge stores of carbon. So the idea of trying to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in soils is very attractive. Microorganisms as the main drivers of those systems determine to a large extent whether carbon is kept in the system or released. So what we're learning as we understand these microbial communities more is microbes have a strong role at determining how stable carbon is in the soil. And actually most of the very strongly stable carbon is held up in microbial necromass, or dead microbial material. So understanding how that carbon gets transferred into those stable states, and the opposite, how carbon is released into the system, will be very important going forward in determining the net balance of carbon in our soils. And then the other aspect is nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide obviously is a very potent greenhouse gas. And so a lot of the focus has been on trying to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, particularly associated with fertilizer application. Microbes transform nitrogen. They're able to fix nitrogen, of course, from the air and provide to plants, but they also return nitrogen back to the air through a process of denitrification mainly, where nitrogen is transformed from plant available forms to either nitrous oxide, which is our greenhouse gas, or to dinitrogen. So how microbes transform that really determines I suppose how much gaseous pollution you're getting. So what we're learning as we look at these communities is the composition of those communities and their activity determine the balance between nitrous oxide and dinitrogen. And as we look into them, we understand that how we manage our soils impacts on the composition and activity of those communities. So recent work we've been doing at Johnstown Castle has shown that, for example, your soil pH and your phosphorus content in your soil strongly impacts those communities and what they're doing, which potentially leads the way to manage those emissions by, for example, liming or phosphorus application. And that could be a very tangible way of trying to reduce the carbon footprint of Irish agriculture.
Fiona, do you think we're doing enough to promote positive actions on the farm to make a significant difference?
It's a good question. I think for many years, soil has kind of been forgotten about, out of sight, out of mind, and we're predominantly grassland country, so often we don't see the soil very often. But I think it's increasingly becoming important on the agenda, particularly the international agenda, because we're realizing how dependent we are on these soils, how important they are as a resource that underpin our whole food and agricultural sector, but also how important they are in terms of I suppose facing the many challenges we're going to face in terms of working towards carbon neutrality, reducing down fertilizer inputs, reducing down greenhouse gases, and working towards more biodiverse and also climate resilient systems. So the challenges we face are enormous, and there's increasing realization that soils are going to have to be a big part of the solution to those issues. And I think as that, I suppose, aspect or outlook on things, we are going to see filtering down to more farm-based, I suppose, awareness. But I think in general, farmers that I speak to are often very, very interested in soils. They're really keen for knowledge, for learning more. And I think we could do more to provide them the resources to think about it. But in the myriad of things that farmers have to think about, I think soil has drifted well down the agenda in the recent decades. I often say, many farmers might, have a look at their machinery, service their machinery at least once a year. I don't know if the same is true of their soils. And of course, soils is far more valuable resource to them than any machine they might have. So I would always encourage farmers to go out and have a look. All you need is a spade, and go out and have a look at your soil and evaluate how it's doing, and particularly in areas you're concerned on in your farm. It's very easy to go out and check in on your soil, and also to think about when you're deciding your management for the coming year. Is there things you can do that might help in terms of enhancing the health of your soils?
Oh, Fiona, I'm going to steal one of Deirdre's quotes now from Leonardo da Vinci, but we know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil underfoot. But I certainly think that you've put a dent in that today from our conversation, and definitely yourself and your colleagues in Johnstown Castle are helping to lead the way in figuring out the complexity of soil. And I really hope that you continue to keep up the great work and bring it to the knowledge transfer side, that we can push it as well. Really enjoyed the chat today, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Fiona.
It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode of the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast. Thanks to Fiona Brennan, Teagasc soil and environmental microbiology researcher, for joining us on the show.
Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Georgia Lane.
Join us next time for the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, signpost to farm sustainability.